Welcome to the Soulfull Sound Podcast. This podcast is about celebrating the leaders, teachers, and coaches who guide fellow humans to connect, heal, and discover themselves so they can express their gifts into the world. I am Simone Niles, a coach, sound healer, vocalist, and author. Thank you for being here with me today.
Oh my goodness, I'm always so excited when I'm in this space, and I am joined today by the beautiful Lee Harris, who is a globally acclaimed energy intuitive channeler and musician who offers grounded, practical teachings focused on helping conscious, intuitive, and sensitive people to heal, thrive, and live a better life. How incredible is that? Lee, welcome, welcome, welcome to the Soulfull Sound Podcast.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you. As you know, I've loved your cousin for a long time. So
Yes.
when you reached out, it was just a joy to come and meet you and learn about all the brilliant stuff you're doing. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And the thing is that I've been following you and your work for quite some time, in fact. So it's such a pleasure to connect with you in this way. Really, really beautiful. Normally, when I plan for my podcasts, I will do my research. I'll have a look at, my guests and what they're doing. And I'll think, okay, I'll just jot some questions down. And I did do that. But interestingly, as I was doing that in this process, something in me senses that this conversation is going to go somewhere I don't even know. It's just going to go. And so I do have a few questions, but I'm really keen to hear the answers and things that come up from you. And then we can just gel and move with that. So yes, shall we get
My kind of conversation.
Yes. So I have been listening. I've been so much enjoying and listening to your latest book, Conversation with Disease. I've been following your energy updates for years. I've been following you. But when I've started listening to the book, what was happening when I started planning my questions is every time I got a little further in, you answered it. So I thought, well, what do I leave out now that I know the answer, and what do I leave in? And so I just gelled with that a bit. And these are some of the questions that I feel would be still important to answer, even though I've heard some of it in the book so far. And of course, I will recommend that book later. But for anyone listening just to this first part, life-changing, pick that book up now, whether it's on Audible, which is my preference, or the hard copy. It's an incredible, incredible read and listen.
Oh, thank you. That's great. I'm so glad. You're enjoying it, and everyone who I've heard is enjoying it. So thank you.
Oh, yes, of course. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about was you spoke about when you kind of first had this introduction with disease and these 88 beings from the ninth dimension that you enter into conversation with. And you spoke about maybe being in your 20s, I think you said around 23, where you heard this voice that you knew wasn't yours. It wasn't your own like negative dialogue or self-talk and things like that. And the words you used to describe the difference were really poignant. You said that there was clarity, certainty, and energetic brightness to these voices that came through. And in my listening, I've also noticed that when you are channeling disease, that your resonance changes, your pitch and the rhythm changes when you're in channel mode. And there's this depth to the melody and the rhythm as well. It's almost like this different symphony to when I'm hearing you speak. Beautiful and different. And it's just a really interesting noticing. So the first question is just to hear a little bit more about that introduction. And then the follow-up question, which I'm happy to repeat, is just maybe what advice or suggestions you can give others who are wanting to connect with their guides or other beings.
Wow. Great questions. Okay.
Thank
you. So, I was 23 years old, and I was on the London Underground, which we in England call the Tube.
Yep.
And I was on my way to my job in fundraising, and I was going through all of the negative thoughts I had in my head. At the time, I was an aspiring singer-songwriter, and like I think many of us in the early 20s, you're in that weird place where you're not very far out of being considered a child, but you still don't know enough about who you are as an adult or the adult world to not have a lot going on. I reflect on the 20s, and I think, God, they're tough. They can be very tough for many of us.
Mm.
So I was in that place, and you described the energetic brightness.
Mm.
And the way I can best describe it is, if my negative thoughts that day were making me feel like this,
Mm-hmm.
when I would do the channeling and get the channeled answers, it wasn't just the information that did it, but something would make my whole body and aura just open up. And it was kind of like, oh, everything's okay. Not in a bypassy way. It wasn't that they ever discounted my feelings or said, oh, don't worry about that. That's not the way they spoke to me. And I think if they had, they'd have lost me.
Right.
Because I was someone who had a lot of feelings that I still hadn't yet figured out how to balance and own and kind of be a guardian of, kind of all of those three things, I think,
Yes.
is the work that we do as feeling people. And so when they came in, I remember thinking, oh, God, is this schizophrenia? Which back then was the term. Nowadays, we tend to call it multiple personality disorder. And my first thought when I had that, having had a conversation with them, was, well, if it is, cool, I got a really useful one. It's like, I know that's not
Yes.
it's not an appropriate thing to say, but that was my rationale. I was like, well, I'm not going to stop speaking to this voice, because some of the things they're saying are, I don't want to say mind-blowing, because I think that's an overused word, and I think that tends to take us out of ourselves. But to my life and my perspective,
Yes.
what was mind-blowing was the shift these conversations would create. I would go from being annoyed at somebody for something to having them say, no, this is your problem, and here's why.
Yes.
And instead of getting defensive or feeling told off, they would explain why it was my problem and why I was in a contracted state against this person. And suddenly the whole thing would shift, not just in my mind, but energetically, I would start to release. So that was the process. And as someone who was a huge advocate for things like tarot readings, I loved going for tarot readings since I was 16. Something in the energy in a tarot reading, of course, you have to have the right reader for you.
Of course.
It has to be aligned. It's like anything. I always say, don't stop at the first therapist and blame therapy.
Yes.
Don't stop at the first tarot reader and blame tarot readings. Like anything, we all need resonance and who's right for us.
Yes.
Do you feel called to use your voice and sound in a healing capacity? Learn how to use your voice therapeutically to facilitate healing and well-being. Whether you want to go deeper in your own healing journey or facilitate others in theirs, this training is for you. This online training runs over 5 weekends and offers theory, practice, resources, and support on your path to becoming a qualified sound healer and for your personal healing journey.
Yes.
But I was skeptical about channeling. I was taken to see a channeler, and about a year before it happened to me. And I remember coming out of the room, and he was a really nice man, and I liked chatting to him and his wife before, but then we did the session, his eyes closed, his voice changed. And I remember leaving and thinking, well, he's got some great intuition and advice, but why did he have to put on that voice and do a performance? Why couldn't, I didn't understand. And I totally get why people would think that of me now. They think, oh, it's a performance, or they're making it up, or and I'm like, honestly, if you really think that doing that is like a mass appeal thing, you're greatly wrong.
Yes.
And actually, for me, if anything, what I had to overcome was my own discomfort around doing it in order to do it publicly when I started about 5-6 years after I'd been doing it privately for myself, and then for a few close friends and family, well, not family, but close friends who knew what I did and were into it.
Yes. Yes, and actually that does lead me on to my next question, which is how did you this human challenge, how did you overcome that feeling of being accepted or understood by others, at least in the beginning stages of this expansion and this connection? Because as you said, how do you explain to someone, oh yeah, no, I hear beings from the ninth dimension and this is what, how do you explain that and what did you have to do yourself to overcome those challenges?
I'm not a very scientifically minded person. I have friends who are. So it's interesting. I didn't like the ninth dimension thing is a fairly new thing
Okay.
that they've talked about in the last few years. The 88 beings was not something I knew for about 6 or 7 years. I knew they were a big group
Yes.
and they had explained we're a group. So it's like I get pieces of information when other people ask the questions. I had a friend who was also channeling and they wanted to know everything about where are you from, da da da. I didn't care about any of that, actually. It was
Right.
kind of, it was almost embarrassing because there were other people who go, oh, and where are they? And I'd be like, oh, I don't know. I haven't, I had a much more feeling based relationship with them where
Mm,
to me, the evidence was all about how I noticed the energy change because of my communication with them or because of someone else's communication with them. So for me, the energy was the evidence because as
yes.
an energetic person, I could feel it, see it, know it.
Mm,
Whereas other people, and still we have this in society today where there are the people who will disconnect science from energy without actually understanding that science is the study of energy. It's just
yes.
catching up.
Yes.
So it's fascinating to me that this division that we kind of draw. But in answer to your question, I think for me it was a slow process of being comfortable with it enough to say it to the people I was doing work for around it. But honestly, I was very I segmented it a lot and I
Mm,
basically just wouldn't talk about it. Like even my family didn't know that I was doing clients for the first 2 years almost. And it
mm,
got to the point where I had a job working for my friend, helping her run her business. She was an entrepreneur. She was a horse whisperer. And so I would do a set amount of hours a week for her, admin and some promotion and all those kinds of things. And then I would have to finish my day job and then go and do these readings because they just kept coming from around the world.
mm,
So there
mm,
came a point when I had to tell my family. So I would say very, very slowly.
mhm.
And I learned to read the room.
That's
Like, is
beautiful.
this person the kind of person I can say this to? And I was always very much need to know basis. I was not someone walking into the room going, hi, I'm channeling, because I was very aware. And I didn't want that to disconnect me from people. And I knew
Sure.
for some people, and still today, there's someone in my life who I'm reasonably close to and who I've been in and around for quite a few years. And they through a relative connection, they didn't know I was a channeler. I don't, that just I guess hadn't come up in their awareness. And just recently they said this really clashes with my religious beliefs. And I believe you're opening yourself to the devil and the devil is everywhere and the devil is trying to get us. And I was like, wow, like this is so wildly different to my
Yeah.
set of beliefs about Earth, but they're this person's beliefs.
Yes.
And so that was very interesting to me, so I don't think it's gone away. I think you just learn how to deal with it, how to hold
Mm.
yourself in it, and you do the benefits outweigh the challenges. That's always my barometer.
Right. Yes. I think that's wonderful. And I like you spoke about reading the room because to me, there's something very beautiful and intuitive about that in all situations, right? Connecting with other people, whether you're doing a workshop or you're doing something, you might be delivering the same kind of information, but the people in the room really can, if you're sensitive enough and intuitive enough, guide things in a whole different way, which is kind of like what I said about this conversation. I have no idea where it's going to go, but I'm loving it so far. And I love that. Just before I move on, though, I want to go back to that second piece of the first question. So, the advice or suggestions that you would give to other people who are thinking, you know what, I'd really want to get in touch with my guides or deeper connection with my intuition, whichever way you want to shape it. What are some of the things that they can start doing if they're at that beginning stage but willing?
Well, actually, I did a free class, which is on YouTube. And
Amazing.
Simone, maybe we can put the link in the show notes. It's about an hour long, and maybe it's longer than an hour. And it's called Working with Your Guides. I did it a few
Amazing.
months ago.
Oh, great.
So that's a free, like full on,
Mhm.
hour and something if you want it. But I'll give you the cliff notes. I always say to people that you don't necessarily need to get in touch with your guides. That doesn't need to be the ultimate aim.
Right.
But getting in touch with the voice of your soul or your higher self is vital, because we all have a wider aspect of ourselves than our mind. So some people call it soul, some people call it higher self,
Yes.
some people call it higher power, God, whatever it is for you. Try and not worry so much about where you're trying to get to, but just
Yes.
open up that intuitive conversation. So a very simple way to do it: take a pen and paper, or if you prefer typing, pull up a blank document and simply write, what does my soul want to tell me today? Change the word soul to higher self, or whatever you feel comfortable with. But what does my soul want to tell me today? And then take a moment and just start writing what comes to you.
Yes.
Usually people go, well, how do I know I'm not making it up? And I always say, you are.
Yes, exactly.
I'm like, as a channeler, I'm not taken over by spirit. I'm saying, okay, I'm going to channel for a group now, or I'm going to channel for myself. Our humanity is still involved. And I think this stems from our very old indoctrinated beliefs that spirit and humanity are separate.
Yes.
Whereas you only have to look at nature or animals or just the way that we as humans can interact with each other and light each other up to see that spirit's moving through everything.
Yes.
So you are making it up. So don't let that be a barrier to you free writing and basically just seeing what comes through. And what you'll notice is a lot of people, when they first do this, it's very moving to them.
Yeah.
I remember working with a client for many years, and she wanted to learn to channel, and she was very skeptical at first when she started channeling, because she was a tough cookie. She was a brilliant woman, brilliant businesswoman, and I had a real soft spot for her, but she was tough. And she was a straight shooter, and she was writing this channeling for herself, and she was like, oh, I don't think it's really working. I'm not really getting any useful information. And I said, okay, well, share some of it with me. And she shared it, and it was really nice. It was quite loving to herself about herself. And I said, have you ever spoken to yourself that way? And she went, no. And I went, that's how you know you're channeling. Because first of all, what happens is you need to be calibrated to a more loving frequency than we as humans have perhaps been invited into and trained into culturally. I think in our family groups or in our intimate friendships, we're very good at cultivating love and intimacy, but tribally, if you look at how divided our world is often encouraged to be, that's not in our wiring. So what channeling first often does is calibrates you to love and to see yourself in a more loving and compassionate way than you may have. And then the more you practice it, the more you start to see interesting information. So I always say, what does my soul or my higher self want to tell me today? You do that 3 times a week for a month.
Yes.
And it only has to be 5 minutes. You'll be surprised at what will shift, because the more you focus a little attention there every now and then, the more that way of seeing and perceiving the world starts to become your I won't say your reality, but included in your reality. I have a very grounded view of life and a very intuitive view of life, and they intermingle all the time. So to me, that's what the benefit of a channeling practice or an intuitive practice can do for you.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love the dance in those two spaces because I'm often finding myself moving around. I do personally tend to have to ground quite a bit. I'm a relatively grounded person, but I like my foot in that other space so much that sometimes I'm like, okay, just come back into this space and dwell a little bit more. So it's an interesting dance in my personal practice. And I really relate to what you said about intuition as well, because when I teach people to become sound healers, there is the science part, understanding music, music and frequency and sound and intervals and, all of this stuff that we learn in physics and things about energy. And then there's the intuitive piece. And how I often talk about it, very similar to you, is that you'll be doing something and then something will come up, and often you'll have the internal dialogue, that part of you that's questioning, is this real? Is this really happening right now? Is this real? And I said, rather than shut that part of you down, just ask it a question. What if it is real? Mm. This is just information. It's not right. It's not wrong. It's just information. And if you take it as just information, then often when you're called to share it with the client, it will either resonate or it won't. But it's just information. So I love that you're talking about that free writing in a way that just let whatever wants to come through. You're not there to judge it. You're just there to let it out. And then you'll start to notice that shift and that pattern as things evolve.
Yeah, and I love what you just described so well, which is the rewiring process we go through, which is actually a far bigger part of it than the doing of the channeling itself, because it's what I've found. I think some of the biggest workshop rooms I've done, because I've done all sizes over the years, but even when I've been in a big room of, say, 300, 500 workshop participants, whenever I propose this exercise to the room, at least 50% of them look horrified and go into contraction. Yeah. And it's like, I thought, we're here, you're supposed to do that. I'm just supposed to sit here and watch and listen. And yet it's always those people. I've never seen anybody. There was one lady once who said, I didn't get any words, but I just felt really peaceful. Is that wrong? And I said, no, that's great.
That's beautiful.
You connected to something, but I'm always blown away by how everyone can do it. But one thing I'm reminded of is, why don't we? And I have that too. Like I've had periods in my life where I'll suddenly go, hang on a second, why am I not channeling about this? I've been pondering this thing for 3 or 4 days. I'm much better now because I've learned to remember that I will have amnesia around spirit, even though I do it for a living, because they say we all forget that we can connect at any moment because it's not in our programming. Yes. And programming that relationship so that your spiritual connection can be a part of your life. It's a little bit like finding a limb that you didn't know you'd lost. It's like suddenly a piece of your life clicks in and it can enhance the whole of everything that you do. And I think that's one of the missing understandings. What I often see in the war against spirit or intuition is some idea that you are supposed to abandon who you are and immerse yourself into this intuitive realm. No, it's just a forgotten piece, a forgotten aspect. And so I love the way you described it, because I think that journey is the real work when it comes to channeling, letting yourself reprogram how you saw it, how you saw yourself.
Yeah, that's beautiful. A lot of rewiring and reprogramming needed. Oh, yes.
Isn't that the truth?
Indeed. And I wanted to ask you a question, actually, and I had this in mind listening to the book earlier, based on some of the things that you just shared. And I know that a lot of people have this question. So it is obviously when you're in a channeling mode, as you said, you're not separate. It's not like you've gone off and they've overtaken your body and you don't have no clue where you are or anything like that. At the same time, my question is really, how much do you witness in the moment? And then how much then do you reflect or even listen back to yourself or the messages that have come through you?
Yes. So I have never listened to, I think I've listened to 30 minutes of one of the conversations with the Z's recording. We have now done about 13. 3 are in the first book, 5 are in the next book, which will come out in May of 2023. Yes. I don't like to listen back to it or watch it. I find it a little challenging.
Okay.
But what I do here in the moment is it's a little bit like I'm sitting behind myself. The problem is, so for example, we just did this course called Initiation where I was channeling for an hour and 15 minutes and taking the participants on a journey. And my team members afterwards who were collecting, certain quotes or certain details would say, oh yeah, and then that bit when they talked about what's going on under the earth, and I'd be like, oh yeah, I remember that, but it's so fast and it's coming through you and it's not, So I get headlines, but I don't tend to remember. There's normally, I'll come out of a 1 hour channeling session and there might be 3 or 4 things that piqued my interest. But my experience is it's a little bit like I'm sitting directly behind my body and I'm listening. But I could stop the channeling at any time. So if I wanted to just stop the whole thing, I can. But normally within about the first 30 to 45 seconds of them starting the speaking, it's like I've really moved out of my own mind. It's a process I'm very used to now.
Yes.
But at the beginning, it was strange. And of course, it's always a little nerve-wracking because you never know what they're going to say, but your name and your voice, so it's all, I mean, luckily I have enough history with them now that there's a trust there,
of course,
and enough experience. But yeah, so my experience is abstract, but when I edit the books, I tend to see it all again, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting, but I can't retain it all.
Yeah, it's like, hey guys, I need a toilet break. Be back in 5.
Yeah.
Yes, and so I know that on this 3-dimensional plane, we're going to be using language and words to try to describe things that is just beyond the way we would normally describe it or could even understand or describe it. And so in your channeling experience, you obviously share things through conversation and language. You speak what's coming through. Are you hearing internal dialogue when that's happening? Or are you sensing? Because you mentioned that for you, it's very kinesthetic and you feel. So what's your transmission? Because we know what ours is. We hear it coming out of your mouth.
Great question. They have said a couple of years ago, they said that they use they said I have a developed sense of empathy and energy. Of course, a developed sense of empathy and energy might mean I'm good at 7 aspects of it, but there are 30.
Yes.
So like all of us, I'm sure there are strengths I have and areas I'm not as developed in. But they say that they use my emotional radar to feel and sense how things are landing. And I think because I've been working on camera as an intuitive, back when I did readings, I think I started doing them on camera in 2005. So I was on Skype back then, way before. I think everyone's on it now because of the last few years. But so I had to develop that ability that if I'm not in the room with the person, can I intuitively tap in? Can I reach out? So there is a feeling sense in my body that I have, but it's very stream of consciousness. So when I'm speaking, like for example, with my energy updates, I always think of that as like halfway between the Z's and my own perception.
Right.
But for me, when I am channeling the Z's, as is in the Audible book, it's the original conversations that took place that we turned into a book. It's not rated. Then I can hear the first sentence or 2 in my head before I start speaking the first sentence or 2. And then once I start speaking the first sentence or 2, it's straight through. So I never hear anything. But if I can talk to them right now, like if I stop for a second.
Yes.
So yeah, they said, you're enjoying yourself, aren't you? And I'm like, yeah, because, it's lovely connecting with you. And, I was excited, especially because of the space you hold around Soulfull Sound. So I can do that any time of the day. And then it's just me hearing them. But when I'm channeling them through my body, there isn't a warning before what's coming. And also they use language that, in general, the language I know, and they say that I have a wide vocabulary, so that helps them.
Yes.
But there are some words that come through that I'm like, I have to look that up, or I sometimes notice the word might be wrong. Like I'm like, oh, was that my inability, my lack of translation ability? Or I'm always fascinated by that, because it's interesting when these words are coming through fast, to kind of hold your energy to be able to keep up with it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love it. I love that you are in that also curiosity in this, especially after such a long time. There's always this learning and growth within you as you continue to go through these experiences. So this is amazing. In your book, you spoke about, I'm gonna quote a very particular word because I loved the way you spoke about it. And you said in the beginning that when you entered this whole realm, you had to surrender to the unplanned magic.
Mm.
I love that. The topic of surrender is one whole conversation on its own, but I want to talk a little bit more about that. What is your process or your relationship to surrender?
Gosh, it's so funny, Simone, because I'm also a planner. Like,
Yes.
Stephen, my husband, and I joke about this. So we've just we just got this little apartment near my family in England, which has made me so
Mm,
happy because now
amazing.
we can have a home here and come here a bit more often. And
And then I
um
get to see you in person.
yes,
Yes.
exactly. And I have spent the last, 3 months pulling all of this together so that when we
Mm,
arrived, the ground was laid. And of course, in my work, the reason I have a great team
mm,
and there's a lot of planning.
yeah,
So I always think in a weird way, you have to lay the ground and the foundation for the surrender magic to happen.
right.
You
Okay.
think of a retreat that either you attend or that you run. So much work goes into getting that container ready so that the participants can come and have this magical experience. But it
Yes.
doesn't tend to be random in our very 3D world.
Mm,
So for me, the surrender to magic is always there whenever I do any intuitive or channeling work. And for me on a personal level, that's really good
mm,
because it's a beautiful sprinkling of fairy dust into life. But I think the surrender to the magic, for example, with the book, I had asked Diana Edwards, the psychotherapist and friend of mine, who had had several private conversations with the Z's when we would spend time together as friends. And they were always fascinating because she would ask the kinds of things I wouldn't even think about.
right.
And I'd asked her, I said, oh, could we do a couple of recordings for my portal community, my members
Mm,
group? And that was it. We were supposed to do 2 audio recordings just to see how it went and will this work? And literally after we'd started, I think we'd done 2 or 3, I literally heard, this can be a book series. And
mm,
if you're willing to do it, we have a lot of topics to cover. And this can be many, many, many books. So that to me was the surrendering to the unplanned magic. For example, there's the art
mm,
of channeling, which is, I don't really know what's going to happen. A bit like you said with this conversation,
right.
right now we're in this creative moment where we're
Mm,
just surrendered to what's going to come through. And we are highly influenced by your listeners and your
mm,
viewers because they're in it too. So
yes, of
it's
course.
not just us. We're in this container that contains in the future all of
Yes.
the listeners and viewers who are co-creating what comes through us. So to me, that's the surrender to the magic part, which you can see as channeling. You can see it as cooking in the kitchen with random ingredients that you found in your fridge, and you're like, oh, can this work? And lo and
Mm,
behold, you cook it, and it's like, wow. So
yes.
I think we're always able to surrender to those magical moments in life, whether they're what we might consider more mundane, which is
Mm,
often some of the most beautiful that there are,
exactly. Yes.
or whether it's, all the bells and whistles mystical experiences, which are their own wonderful thing, particularly when they first wake you up,
Mm,
particularly in those first few years when you reopen to the spirit realm and you're like, oh my God. And then I personally love the stage I'm at now, where I
mm,
just see it as normal. There
mhm.
are no longer these massive, rocket ships to the sky, although they still happen sometimes, but they're more
Yes.
balanced in me. And I know how to balance and ground them now in a different way.
Yeah, and even though they're unexpected, you expect the unexpected now. So
Yes.
there's that element of
Well
that's
said.
okay, which is beautiful. So I'd love to ask you a more personal question because I know that in the field, I think it's probably the same for you, though I don't like to assume. But I know certainly in my field and with the people around me, often people have a view when you're in a place where you're sharing, ways of healing and transforming and the work that we do in healing and so on, that you don't have your own issues, you don't have your own problems. It's like you make it look so easy, basically, with all the things that you share. And I've had that even with personal friends, and I'm like, oh, it's interesting why people think that. They said, but isn't it true? You never seem to be sad. I don't see you angry. I don't see you. I said, really? I was like, it's kind of a surprise, because of course I feel all of those things.
Yeah.
So my question really is, what is a personal challenge that you, with all the things that you know and all your growth and transformation, that you still go through now, whether that's a pattern that you want to change in yourself or a behavior, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, but a personal challenge that you're going through in life right now or in general?
Great question. I would say stress and overwhelm.
Mm.
And obviously, we just bought an apartment, so that adds to your load. But I have a relationship. I can get a lot done, and I'm a producer. I'm a generator. That's kind of a lot of my id, if you like. And I've come to understand that's who I am. And I look back at my childhood, and that was who I was. The relationship to stress and overwhelm is something I mentioned to Stephen the other day. And he said, quite rightly, he said, you're so much better at it now than you were when we met 7 years ago. And that is true. But that for me is not a place I like to find myself. And of course, it's going to happen. So there are two things I'm working on around that. Number one, of course, with overwhelm, you always have to look at, are you overbooking yourself? Are you overscheduling yourself? Which I used to do a lot.
Right.
I really don't do that very much anymore. However, I do enjoy living life and my work to the full and keeping that balance. So, but I would say stress and overwhelm are states of being that recently in the last few months, I've kind of got my eye on changing those coming up. Not in a way that I'm like, okay, I don't want to judge them and I don't want to create a story around them, but I'm looking at them going, what would have to change in my behaviors and patterns for me to get to a place where stress and overwhelm is not really a factor? And it's a tricky thing for me to say, because I also think I'm probably more resourced in my inner outer life than I've ever been. And I feel like incredibly grateful for the life I have and what I get to do, the person I love, my family, my friend. I've never been so grateful about life, even with all the crazy going on in the world. Yes. And how hard that is on certain days and how your heart breaks, but still stress and overwhelm, I would say. And I think also the growth of things around you.
Yes.
On the one hand, it's wonderful. And on the other hand, you have to dig really deep to go, okay, where is the growth not good? Where is it costing me and my life? And what do I have to trim or change to kind of shift things? So I'm very, very fortunate that I have my own production company. I'm not somebody's thing. That I have to go and do what they say, which trust me, in my 20s, if I could have signed myself over to a record company or some spiritual house or agency, I would have. And thank God I didn't. And thank God I never had those opportunities. But still, those I would say are two of the things that I've been tracking a little bit the last few months when they come up.
Yeah, and I think they're the key really is the self-awareness around it. Because I've asked you that and you knew straight away, right? You just knew that I'm looking at these things and I'm finding my way through whatever I feel are the remedies, if you like, or the ways through it, rather than around it. And I like that. I mean, stress and overwhelm is so common for so many people. So that's a really great share. I think a lot of people will get some value from that piece as well, which is awesome.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting? Because I remember growing up, we never talked about that. That was just a fact of life. But actually, there is going to be a certain level of stress or occasional overwhelm being human. But it is interesting to look at it and go, okay, what can I adjust? And what do I need to put into place? I have a very good friend who I haven't seen for a long time, but wonderful person. And we were just talking lately and she was really stressed. And I said, well, what can you what can you trim? What can you cut? And she was like, oh, I can't let people down. And I went, and trust
Here
me,
it is.
I was you years ago,
Yeah.
I was you. And these days I'm like, oh, this week's a bit overscheduled. What is the least impactful thing on everybody that I can remove? And of course, if it's a crisis or an emergency, then I'm just going to change things. And it's so interesting, our cultural programming around what we are and aren't allowed to do. And I think the women in my life, because they are often the biggest caregivers and nurturers, as well as everything else they do, they tend to have the harder time in that, 9 times out of 10, more so than men.
Yeah, and I think culturally we glorify being busy.
Yeah,
Oh, Harry, I'm so busy. Like it's this badge of honor, you
true.
know? It's like sometimes just like actually I'm actually have a lot of free time. I'm not doing much right now, which is pretty cool. I hardly say that myself to be fair, but I recognize that's
I do
something that
too.
we've learned to do. And I love that you found many ways. In fact, just yesterday I had a client and she came into the session very teary because she was so overwhelmed. She
Mm.
had so many things on her list and she just looking at it, just she couldn't, she said she feels like it's an all or nothing right now. And my first instinct was to go into, okay, what's on your list that you don't have to prioritize, or what can you delegate? Then I thought, hang on a second. Right now in this state of overwhelm, she may not make the best decisions.
Mm.
So I said, let's just sound it out. Let's just sound it out a bit. And I got her into a sounding practice so she could just release what that overwhelm felt like in her body and in her being and in her energy, to the point that she said it was an 11 when I asked if it was 10, and out of scale of 1 to 10, 10 being overwhelmed. She said it was an 11. And after maybe 10 minutes of sounding, she got to a 4. And I was
Mm.
like, that's so beautiful. I said, now when you think about all the things that you need to do, what needs to change? And that was such a beautiful witnessing. So I kind of throw that there because sometimes the state of stress and overwhelm, you just need to deal with that in that point, and not all the things that are causing it, but
Yes.
the actual state itself. Then you have a better place, kind of a neutral or reset or groundedness that you can then look at the rest. So it's such a cool thing to experience.
Beautiful. And it's so interesting because, we've been here for a week now in the UK. And I'm reminded, of course, because there's a big family here,
Mm,
lots of different family groups. And I'm, because Stephen and I have a relatively quiet life, obviously the work life is very productive, and we have a relatively quiet life in California, and we've missed a few Christmases in the UK. I forgot
mm,
how busy everyone gets. It's like, oh yeah, and I actually canceled something I was going to do a couple of nights ago because I could feel that
mm.
rising in me. I'm like, oh, there isn't quite enough time to do all the
Yeah.
things. And I'm always reminded, especially when you get to a place of practicing that, the first time you do it, if you've got a lot of guilt, it might not feel good to you. You may even manifest a negative reaction from other people because you're not used to giving yourself that space. And so
Yes.
you have people around you who aren't willing to give you that space either, because they're not
Mm,
used to that from you. But over time, you get to a point where people don't really mind. And often I've heard this many times, oh, I'm kind of glad that kind of suits me. Whereas I might have gone through a moment of going, oh, is that fair to do? Well, no, I'm really feeling I need to do it. And for me, I have like a body test that I do, which
yes.
helps get me out my head.
Mm,
And it's literally, let's say you're supposed to go to this party and you have this thought of, oh, I don't know if I really want to go. To get out of my head, I ask my body to tell me
mm,
about the future. And I literally go, okay, body, 10, 15 seconds to show me the feeling of going to the party tonight. I just
mhm.
feel that. And then I go, okay, 10, 15 seconds to show me the feeling of not going
Not
and
going.
staying home. And I'm like, oh, that really surprises me. I felt more open and uplifted going to the party than
Mhm.
staying home. So it works both ways. It's not just telling you what you want to hear.
Of
Sometimes
course.
you're like, oh, actually, I felt more, okay, well, maybe I'm supposed to go. I'm a bit tired now, but maybe I'll just sit down for 10 minutes or whatever. So the body
Yeah.
test for me is very helpful with that
Mm,
very useful thing that you just shared, which is when we're up here, we
mm.
aren't going to make clear decisions. We're
Yeah.
in that spin.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I was recently doing some workshops on creating boundaries, and it's
Mm,
similar, a body test I spoke about. In fact, the same example of a social event of what a yes feels like in the body and what a no feels like
mm.
in the body. And we actually do know, and we can practice that. So I think it's incredible. So we have a very similar formula, if you like, in how we kind of access those things. I can go on and on and on about your channeling and your book because I'm enjoying it so much, but you're an incredible musician, and I have to talk about that too. So I compose a lot of things now in very much, I would call them healing compositions. It's all about healing and transformation. And when I go into the studio, I often actually say it's a channeled experience because I don't know what's going to come out of me. I go in with a loose plan of a theme so that some of the elements that I know scientifically, let's say, support the theme are embedded. But otherwise, I would literally just do a vocal for half an hour and
Mm.
improvise mostly on sounds, vowels, shapes, less lyrical, and just whatever wants to come out wants to come out. And then I don't edit very much. I take out a few things if it feels too busy, like the frequency is not as clean, but I never redo a take. And I know from my experience coming from the music business where I was on stage, I was touring, I was backing vocalists for this artist and that artist. I was really like, this has got to be proper. The technique has to be there. I was in my shining on this note and all of that. And then when I got into this, I was like, it doesn't matter how I sound. And that was a really interesting shift because I was like, what? It's not about sounding pretty. It's about sounding authentically, and whatever needs to come out needs to come out. Fortunately, I have embedded some techniques, so it makes it an easier job, let's say. But I know that for me, it feels very much free and open, and I know whatever comes out is right in that moment. So I'd love to know, as a singer-songwriter and composer yourself, like what is your process in creating the music that you're creating? And then let's talk about your new album.
Well, firstly, I need to hear some of these 25, 30-minute recordings,
I
please.
can't
'Cause
wait.
You
I'm going
you
to send it to
describe
you.
them, and I'm like,
I'm
oh, it
about to
sounds
send it to you. Don't
amazing.
worry.
Yes,
Yes.
please. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Um, well, it's interesting because and the Z's explain this in it's either book 2 or book 3, and of course, book 3 won't be out until 2024, which seems crazy now. But they explain that they got me first through music. So
Mhm.
when I was 21, I started hearing these compositions in my head. Now, I had been a lover of music my whole life. I had sung in musicals, and I was doing lots of that kind of stuff when I was younger. But I had never ever thought I would be someone who would hear music, and I would not only hear these melodies and these lyrics. Often the lyrics would be attached to the melodies, or at least half of the lyrics, and then I would
Mm.
have to craft the rest. But also like arrangement details and orchestrations. And so it was the exact same part of my head. This is
Mm.
where I hear the Z's. Just for me, it's above the left-hand side of my head. It's different for all of us.
Mhm.
And they said, we got you first through music. And then 2 years later, you were ready to open up your channeling. And funnily enough, one of my musical friends at that time, when we were both at drama school together, was your wonderful cousin, Sarah, who we love and
Amazing.
adore.
Yes.
And yeah, and so I remember at the time, it felt like the best thing that had ever happened to me. Like
Mm.
when I started hearing music, I was in love. Like I was like, oh my God, this is a miracle. And
Mm.
and still to this day, it's amazing to me. Obviously, I'm a bit more used to it now, but um, so the way it works for me, and what was interesting was back then, I was very much passionate about healing and metaphysics as uh, a student, only as a student, still a student today, but now also a teacher of it.
Mm.
So my songwriting, I would say, as is not uncommon in your early 20s, was very personally focused half of the time,
Right.
and were healing songs. What has shifted as I've done more of the channeling work is I've started to write music for the groups more. So, for example, Devor, who is my music brother, he is based in Slovenia. We met in 2012. He's an
Mm.
incredible musician and arranger and producer. And he was saying this to me the other day. We are like the perfect fit because we
Mm.
both complete things that the other needs to be able to do what we do. So, you know, it's a
Beautiful.
music marriage and a very deep friendship. So it's been incredible with him that I brought him on board initially to soundtrack some of the channels that I was putting out. We met on stage, we were put together on stage at a channeling conference, and we did one experiment with making a pop album, because he had, unbeknownst to me, he'd been a successful musician and performer in Slovenia his whole life. And we tried this pop album, which is called Arise. It came out in 2014, and then we remastered it in 2016. And it's like a spiritual pop album in that the lyrics are spiritual. And very proud of about half of the record. And the other half was an experiment that we didn't quite, you know, that we both go, okay, we were cutting our teeth.
Yeah.
But then what happened was the healing influence and the channeling work, we started writing songs in the workshop room. So he would be there scoring the channeling. Everyone would go off for lunch for 90 minutes or 2 hours if it was a long 1 week retreat. And we would stay in the room, and I would say, okay, we've got a lot of abandonment going on this morning. Rejection has been a theme. And the way through that we've identified is people reconnecting to themselves, not looking for outer approval. And so we would write that song. So I do, 95% of the lyrics, usually 100, but sometimes Devor will throw in some on the words. I do all the top line melodies and the harmonies, and then Devor will do all of the arrangement. And sometimes he will give me chords and I'll respond to those. Other times I take a song to him and he will flesh it out and perhaps adjust some of the bass chords and the foundation. So that's really how it works. But what's been most interesting is fusing the healing with it. So I would say that the music we do these days fits into two categories. It's either slap bang in sound healing, or we're taking what you might consider an alternative pop sound. And I don't mean shiny pop. Yes. I mean pop, the popular kind of music that you hear today with great drums and bass and brilliant synths. Devor is a vintage synth aficionado. His studio is full of vintage synthesizers, but then we bring in organic instruments too and tune it all to 528 hertz, which is a healing frequency and a frequency of love. So everything gets tuned to that. And then as well as the direct sound healing, we produce this, you could say, alternative pop sound healing music. And that's the journey that we're on. And it's been amazing. We've been releasing a lot of music the last few years because we were able to really focus on it. And I heard a soul calling on an airplane. I was feeling real, it's a long story, but I was feeling a draw around music. And in my head, I thought, well, I can't really do that because I haven't got the time and that's not what people want me for. I've got this very busy thing going on that's growing. And I literally channeled for myself and they said, without music, your soul will crumble. And I was like, whoa. Yeah. So it was the greatest permission slip. So I basically went, okay, I'll figure this out. I will start to, so I really rolled up my sleeves and figured out, how do we make this viable? I learned more about music distribution. I just rolled up my sleeves like an entrepreneur to try and figure out how we could fund the music and make it work. And that's what we've been doing.
Yes. And I know you have an album that just came out as well. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Timelines came out 7 days ago as we're recording this. Yeah, which was amazing. It came out December 2nd.
Amazing.
And it's a really, it's a funny album in that I remember when we finished the mastering, which was almost a year ago in February, I was a little unsure about the track listing because I was thinking, God, this is such a hybrid album. Like, does this work? We've got these very cosmic songs and very spiritual songs, and then we've got some more, does this work? And I'm thrilled to say that based on the response, it really works, because we've, people just this week, and also we attached it to a course. Amazing. So Timelines, like all of our albums, there's a healing through line in every song. And some of the songs one of the songs is 20 years old. I wrote it when I was in my late 20s, but it's a song that haunted me. I kept thinking, you need to take that to full term. And funnily enough, it's a song about boundaries and about spirituality. It kind of fuses learning about human boundaries, accelerated by seeing my guides for the first time, a visual I had of them. And so the song is called Glimmers and Silhouettes, because the line is, look up ahead, glimmers and silhouettes, never seen anything like this before. Compromise dead, words I have never said, prepare to hear. And of course, that related to my human boundary journey.
Yes.
But I also realized later, oh yeah, I was about to start channeling words that I have never said publicly. So
that's beautiful.
Yeah. So yeah, putting that album out is delightful. And the way I look at music, I don't know if it's the same for you. Music is this extraordinary invisible force that we all accept. Mm-hmm. Not many people have a problem with music, and music moves into and through our bodies, and it changes us. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to think about religious beliefs or ideology or whether you're a science person or a spirituality person. Music is an accepted invisible force. So to me, I'm so grateful that music exists, and the music that I listen to, I love.
Yes.
And it's lovely to be able to put something out there and hopefully have it move people the way that you are moved by the music that you enjoy.
Yes. So there are two things that I want to say. It's very timely talking about boundaries, because I asked you about your personal thing that you're looking at. And for me, I have certain patterns around boundaries, not in general, but in other ways that are actually now, I would say in the last year to 2 years, being deeply uncovered. So not the surface stuff, but the stuff really deep. And I've been invited through the coaching and the work that I do to talk a lot about boundaries. So I've been invited to go through a transformation through sharing, which is so beautiful. And so I can't wait to listen to Glimmers and Silhouettes. I'm going to listen to that because I'm going to feel the frequency. And then the second piece is, yes, I see music in a very similar way. And I would also add that we are music. I feel that we are sonic beings. We have our own unique compositions, and those are being heard in so many different ways, and they're resonant. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're really resonant, and really it's just about getting back in tune with ourselves. And I like to see the world and people in that way. I kind of see us as these sonic energies moving around, which doesn't surprise me from my past, my path, and the things that I'm interested in looking at further.
Beautifully said. Yeah, so true. And it's interesting because the Z's have said that, and I shared this with you before we started the conversation, the recording, that they said from 2030 onwards, sound healing will be a far more understood and accepted part of the way that we live, which makes sense, because if you think about it, in tribal culture,
yes,
people dance and sing, which is so important to our health and our well-being. Yes. And yet often, certainly in the Western world that I was raised in Britain, that was not necessarily something that was celebrated or revered. And even the more passive act of listening to music that we've adopted. I love that recorded music exists, but I also think it's wonderful when people are in a stadium at a concert and they're all singing and they're moving. And I think that's what it's about, you know, so whether you're doing that in your house or in a group, I think it's designed to move through us and move us in a beautiful way.
Yes, and I would say culturally, for me, coming originally from Barbados and Trinidad, music and movement have been and are still big parts of our culture. It's just, it is celebrated and revered. So I'm very grateful for that, I guess, initial, I don't know if to say molding, because it's not a mold, but that cultural influence that has set the tone for a lot of, I think, what I do now. So this is incredible. As a musician, as someone who's in sound, I always love to ask people this question: what sound do you love?
Our cat's purring.
Oh gosh, I know.
Close. Like just hearing them there. I love hearing our cats purring. I love hearing my husband Stephen laugh. He has about 10 different laughs, and you know, if I'm in another room and I just hear him laughing at something, that just makes me happy.
You know which one it is. You know which laugh.
Yeah. And then, you know, musically, I can't get over piano music, you know, just modern classical pianists like Ludovico Einaudi, Niels Fram, Olafur Arnolds. They're some of my favorites. And so, yeah, there are lots of sounds, but I've just realized you asked me for one and I gave you three. So I will
That's
stop
all
there.
right. I know it's never an easy one to stick to one, but I do love a cat's purr too. This is the first time I've had a cat in my life as an adult, in fact, and there is a lot of healing in the frequency of a cat's purr, and they're so intuitive. So often they go where they feel that you need it, and I think that's quite an interesting thing. I just love it. I love that response. Do you ever do any collaborations with your music? I know you have your marriage with your
With
musical
Devore.
marriage with Devore,
Actually,
yes.
yeah, we're very collaborative. And it's funny because Devore comes from, like, he wrote an opera in Slovenia, a rock opera that was
Oh,
Slovenia's
cool.
longest running opera. So he is quite used to being a musical director.
Right.
So with all of our albums, I want to say, I mean, I know on our first album, or our first of this new wave album, Awaken, I want to
Mm,
say 35 people were on that album.
amazing.
But collaboratively, vocally, what I most enjoyed about this album, Timelines, is Wendy Kennedy, who is a very dear friend of mine. She's a channeler and she
Mm,
also channels light language. We
amazing.
got to put some of her light language into a track that felt
Mm,
like it would benefit from that. So that was cool. And then Ricky Byers, formerly Ricky Byers Beckwith, who
mhm.
was married to Michael Bernard Beckwith for many, many years, and she would do the all the music at Agape in LA.
Yeah.
She is a guest vocalist on Somewhere Between on Timelines, and I
Mm,
have loved Ricky's voice since I first heard it many years ago. And so asking her and her saying yes, I will bring my
amazing.
voice. She has this. We needed a really wise, powerful, embodied, and surrendered voice, and Ricky
Mhm.
is that. So
Oh, that's
yeah,
amazing.
we collaborate as much as we can.
I love that. Well, I can't wait to listen to the album, and of course, I will be popping that and all the other links below. I think we need to have another conversation in the future because
That would be great.
there's just so much that's still brimming, and I know that that we're coming close to our time. So I want to say first and foremost, thank you so much for your presence and who you are and all the work that you're doing to help people heal and thrive and just really connect deeply with what's possible. And I just love the way you're doing it. It resonates with me because I know we have, not because we also, but also because we have some similarities in sound healing and sound and voice that I can so relate, but also just all the incredible things I've witnessed you over the years helping people with their businesses, with their intuition. It's like you kind of tackle it from all angles, all dimensions, all ways, so holistically and beautiful. And I'm super, super grateful and honored to have you join me in this part of the podcast as well. So thank you so much for your yumminess,
Thank
Lee.
you. Well, thank you for having me. It's been absolutely delightful. And I'm honestly I'm incredibly grateful that I get to do what I do in such a multidimensional way. It's not lost on me that, it's a very privileged position that I get to be in. So to me, I'm blown away that that this gets to be my job. So yeah, I'm very grateful for that. And thank you. And thank you for having me.
Of course. And we, of course, will put all of the links below the episode, and you can find Lee and his website at leeharrisenergy.com. Of course, all the links to follow. But before we close, I ask my guests one final question, Lee, and that what is your soulful sound, which is a self prayer or desire that you wish upon the world?
Hmm. And it's a sound, not a word.
No, it can be a word or a phrase.
Aha.
I call it a soulful sound because to me, whatever you expressed is that sonic expression of it. So you can sound if you like, but also you can speak into it.
You know that it's December, so I guess it's in the air, but peace on earth.
Mm,
Peace on earth. Like if we culturally were able to attain, generate, and hold peace in ourselves as a world, the planet would look so different. And of course, in our lifetime, will we see that? Who knows? Probably unlikely. We're probably this continuing bridge generation. But I think when you say the words peace on earth, to me, what that means is a harmonic frequency that can exist between people, for the planet, for all of the creatures. Yeah, peace on earth.
Peace on earth. Well, here's some peace on earth. So much love. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share it with your friends and remember to subscribe. From my heart to yours, sending you love, healing, and sound wherever you are.